This is the warning, and live from the Cannon House office building is Congressman Ro Khanna, a bright light in a dim time. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate your voice out there.
What is the mood amongst your fellow Democrats right now?
Well, it's one of introspection to see what we need to do in terms of connecting with rural communities, with deindustrialized towns, factory towns, communities of color, working class voters to build trust. But it's also one of resolve, a sense that we can win back in 2026, win back in 2028, stand up to the president when he engages in actions that are extreme and betray the people who voted for him.
Do you feel like that there's a plan or a plan coming together inside the House where there is a vision to be able to block, to pick up a couple vulnerable Republican members to help you block Trump from doing his worst, including perhaps even voting to restrict funding to some of Trump's more abusive policies? Has anybody sat down so far and with you in the room, and I would hope you would be one of the people in the room, all right, and said, we're not going to talk about what happened in the election. We're not going to talk about why we're sitting in the minority by 2 seats. We're going to have a conversation about what the plan is going to be come the noon hour on January 20th to be upfront in opposition to the abuses that we know are coming down the highway. Is that going on?
It is. I just was chatting with Jamie Raskin this morning in the House Democratic Caucus, and he was talking about how do we focus our attention on the most egregious abuses. And we're having those conversations with the ranking members on our committees. In fact, this morning we were electing ranking members so that every day on the House floor, in House committees, Democrats are speaking out about what's going on and shining a light to it. In some sense, we are the front lines of letting people know what the Trump administration is doing and calling it out. In terms of Republicans joining in that effort, the Republican caucus has not suddenly become more functional. I mean, just today I'm having to possibly cancel my trip and meetings in New York end of the week because it looks like we're stuck here and they can't get a continuing resolution. So it's not going to take a lot of work to find cracks in a Republican caucus. But right now, under Hakeem Jeffries' leadership, I mean, we're focused on how do we have a vibrant, vocal, strong party ready to go on January 20th, willing to call out the president when he does things that are clearly wrong.
With regard to the continuing resolution, as I understand the politics of this right now, the Speaker, Johnson, wants this to go into March, and Senate Republicans are saying, please God, no, we want a clean slate coming into the Trump presidency. We don't want to be stuck trying to fund the government in the first 60 days of the Trump presidency in the middle of whatever it is he has planned, with the possibility that we have a chaotic situation. Am I assessing that correctly? That's the politics of it?
Yeah, and you've got, as always, some Republicans saying we don't want these continuing resolutions. We want to have a regular process. We want to have a regular budget. The problem is when they want a regular budget, they've got an extreme caucus that wants to cut Social Security, cut Medicare, cut veterans benefits, cut food stamps. And Johnson knows that if they actually made those cuts, they'd lose 30 seats. And so this is the song and dance they've been playing for over a year, that they keep doing the continuing resolution because they don't have the votes on their side to pass a budget that isn't catastrophic.
And what puts Trump in the most difficult position? Do you think punting this till March and giving him the ball?
Well, look, I think that first we're the Democrats are committed to doing what's right for the country. Aren't looking at it from the lens of politics. And what would be terrible is to have some kind of government shutdown before Christmas and before the holidays. So we, as long as they're not making cuts to Social Security and food stamps and veterans benefits, are going to pass the continuing resolution. But I think that is the likely outcome. And then Trump is going to have to decide what is he going to do to get a budget, and where is he going to be willing to cut? And he's going to have a lot of pressure from House Republicans to make cuts for programs that working class and middle class folks rely on.
In this vote, in this debate, so people who are watching and listening to this, so they understand, basically postpones that larger debate until after Trump is president, sometime in March, when this continuing resolution, this basic, we'll put it off till then, postponement comes due.
Correct. The continuing resolution says we can fund government at the levels it is right now, no cuts, but we're going to wait to pass a full budget in March if we get the 3 months continuing resolution.
And this will give Democrats then, in a two-seat minority, probably their maximum point of political leverage in dealing with Donald Trump potentially abusing the powers of the presidency on a range of issues with the power of the purse.
Absolutely. I mean, this is going to mean that Johnson will need Democratic votes. I can't imagine that he's going to be able to get a budget passed without Democratic votes. He hasn't been able to do it so far. And so Hakeem Jeffries, our leader, is going to have the leverage to go to Johnson and say, okay, we're going to give you votes because you're not going to want to be blamed for a shutdown of government. You have every branch. You got the House, you got the Senate, both chambers, you got the presidency. The Supreme Court is Republican appointees. The American people know you're in charge, but if you don't want to fail, we're willing to give you the votes in good faith. But you can't, have a Justice Department trying to put Liz Cheney and Jamie Raskin in jail. You can't be mass deporting 11 million undocumented immigrants, not criminals, but actual immigrants who have American families here, where the American families, American citizens are getting caught up in these raids. And that is a power that the House Democrats will have. Look, I'm biased, Steve, but the action in the first 6 months in terms of standing up to the worst of Trump is going to fall on House Democrats.
No doubt about that. And do you feel like your team is ready? Do you feel like Hakeem Jeffries is ready?
I do. I mean, Hakeem is disciplined. He's eloquent, and he is strong. And the caucus is very united. I mean, I know you read in the press generational battles, and that's all good. I mean, but at the end of the day, it's a united caucus. For example, today we had AOC running against Connolly. I voted for AOC. She lost. Connolly won. AC went over and hugged Connolly. We're all now on the same team, getting the stakes of holding Trump accountable. So are there differences? Sure, but it's as unified a caucus as I have seen in my 9 years in Congress, and that's because people get the stakes.
If you had to take her aside afterwards, what would you say, right? Or what would be fair to say to her that, well, if you want to win one of these elections next time to chair a major committee in the Congress in your caucus, you have to do what?
Well, first of all, I think we should elevate her, and I hope after Connolly, she's next. She got 84 votes, but I would say spend time with some of the key members, some of the more senior members. Just have coffee with them, get to know them, spend time with the Congressional Black Caucus, spend time campaigning as you have so effectively in building a base outside of Congress. Continue to do that within Congress. She did a lot of that. So I don't want to be
Mhm.
seeming like I'm giving her advice that she's not already
No.
doing. She's only been in Congress 6 years. But I think if she continues on that trajectory, she has a very, very good chance of being the chair of the Oversight Committee, which is a big deal. Like Henry Waxman chaired this committee. So to be the chair of this in her 30s, if she's next in line, is a pretty remarkable thing.
You are one of the people that's going to be a really important future leader of the Democratic Party, right? And so at some point, I think for people that are watching this, you're going to become a person who is much better known in the country, is much better known to them, more widely seen on television. I hope Leader Jeffries, for example, is more visible than he's been in laying out that alternative vision. Where do you think things sit right now? How do you observe them? Right? Donald Trump has won. It's not a landslide, but it is a sweep. It's a plurality victory, not a majority mandate, but it is a significant repudiation of the Democratic Party's case on a decade basis that Trump is an existential threat to all of these things that we Democrats stand in favor of that are of the utmost importance. It was just rejected wholesale by the country, I think for a bunch of different reasons. When you observe this moment, process it. 34 days out from Donald Trump raising his hand, taking the oath, the military aids with the nuclear football sliding away from Biden towards Donald Trump, all the powers of state back into Donald Trump's hand with a control of his party of the Senate, narrowly in the House, the courts, and nominating some of the most unqualified people emotionally, temperamentally, character-wise that we've ever seen nominated for office. Where are we, and how did we get here?
That's a big question, Stephen. I'd be curious on your thoughts. I'll tell you where I think people are at. There are a lot of places in America, a lot of communities in America that have seen stagnancy, decline, just a sense this country hasn't been working for them for 40, 50 years. I mean, politicians selling jobs offshore for the cheapest wages and highest profits. You drive through America and you go from town to town, and I know you've probably done this, and if there's a town that doesn't have a prison or a hospital, a lot of times it's just economically devastated. And then the most heartbreaking to me is when they say, oh, there used to be a manufacturing plant here, but now there's a prison, and that's where the economy is coming for a local community. People sensing that costs have gone up. They look at a district like mine, $12 trillion in the coast in Silicon Valley, and they say, how can you have a country that's producing all this wealth and we're not participating and we're stagnant and America just doesn't seem to be working? And, I think the core of Trump's message was very simple. I'm going to get America to win again. I'm going to get you to win again. I'm going to get you to move again. And of course, there's, in my view, not much substance there. I don't think he's going to revitalize Johnstown, Pennsylvania, or Galesburg, Illinois, or bring new industry or bring the new modern economy to people who've been struggling. But I think the way to counter him is, one, to show the hollowness of the actual vision, that it's not getting America to move, and then to convey for us that we're actually the party that can bring together this country, business leaders, venture capitalists, labor leaders, community leaders, faith leaders, and give it a purpose of getting this country to move and win. And I really think it's about conveying to people that we get it, that there's this kind of stagnancy there, and that we have the vision to get them moving again, give their kids a shot again. And I think we're going to get that opportunity in 2026 and then again in 28. And I believe we've got a great bench of talent for the House, Senate, and presidency that's going to be succeeding in doing that.
We live at a time where I joke around about this, right? Where even the adults need trigger warnings now, right? So, anytime I write anything that is oppositional, say, to the party line, and I look back over my last 2 years, when I said, for example, that Biden's candidacy is a real threat with regard to electing Donald Trump and just the idea expressed, right? There's a lot of shouting down, right, that goes on in the Democratic Party that I observe as something that's new, that didn't used to be there in the fabric of the party. And the sooner it goes away, where there can be honest discussions that are reality based, I think the better the party will be. But for the people that are watching this, that have taken away from the election result that the racists have won and Trump's 77 million voters are unfixable, broken, unrepentant, bad people, racists all. What is it that you want to say to them as part of the party and a leader in its future, right? About why they lost and why Donald Trump is about to be sitting in the White House with a Republican House and a Republican Senate. And you listen to some of the voices out of the campaign. I think they're very sincere when they say, they've assessed it, they've taken stock of it, and they ran a flawless campaign pretty much. And so, what would you say, right, beyond just a blanket indictment of the people who voted for Trump? Democrats lost because why? And something that has to change, that's specific, that the party does, is what?
First of all, I believe, Steve, that this is still a very decent country, open country, and the most open political system in the world. And I guess that's based on my experience. I'm the son of immigrants. My grandfather spent 4 years in jail alongside Gandhi for India's independence. My father came here to Michigan to study there in engineering. I was born in Philadelphia in 1976, our bicentenary. I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, at a time where Bucks County was probably 98% white, as an Indian American of Hindu faith. And, the coach said I played Little League, even though I couldn't hit. And I had teachers who said, go publish a local Bucks County Courier Times. And we celebrated Christmas, and we also on my street celebrated Diwali because the neighbors were curious. And I had people who said, you can do anything in America. And at the age of 40, this country elected me, a first generation Indian American, to represent arguably the most innovative, economically powerful place in the world, if not in human history, in terms of producing wealth. That is an American story. And by the way, I went back to Bucks County with a journalist and met my favorite 10th grade social studies teacher, who I really was inspired by. And guess what? It turns out halfway through the interview, he tells the journalist that he's going to be voting for Donald Trump. And the journalist said, well, what if it was Trump versus Khanna? And you could tell he's so pained. He's like, well, I respect Ro Khanna. I really like Ro Khanna. It'd be a tough decision. And the journalist is like, he's voting for Trump. And my point is, more people need to actually go figure out why. And talk to people who are voting for Trump. You can be George Wallace being racist. You don't become president of the United States if there are not a lot of people voting for you. And I think the fundamental thing that Trump did was tap into an anger with people feeling left out of modern economic prosperity, feeling that the political system was not working for them, the economic system is not working for them. And we have to come in and say, we've got a better, more compelling vision. And by the way, it's not going to be politician driven. It's going to be assembling a team of business leaders, of labor leaders, of local community leaders. And this is, we've talked about this before. That's what FDR did. FDR, he wasn't great in and of himself. Maybe he was temperamentally, but he said, I'm going to bring the best of American talent and we're going to solve this issue of the Great Depression. We're going to win the World War. Guess what? The Democratic Party has the opportunity to be that convening force. We can be the unifiers. We can put everyone on the field with talent to help revitalize this country. But we need to realize it needs revitalization. It's not just about the defense of the current status quo and institutions, because they're not working for a lot of people.
I think that Trump is somebody who ran against a couple of institutions simultaneously. He ran against the Republican Party as it was, and he destroyed it. It's gone. He ran against the Democratic Party, and he ran against the American news media as a business, as an ethic, against its smugness, against its judgments, against its condescensions, and against its greatest sin, which is the invisibility that they've imposed on wide swaths of the country. One of those cohorts is the million plus that have died from opioids, which I think at the earliest, I'm going to say we had our first kind of serious national discussion about this in 2016 at a presidential race level, and the problem had been a crisis for much longer than that. You talked about driving across the country. I did it last week, and because I'm married to a Canadian, we crossed the border and we came down the old Route 66. And you get to Oklahoma in this country, and you enter Indian country. You enter the Cherokee Nation, and then from Oklahoma across Texas, across historically the lands of the Comanches, into the Navajo Nation in Arizona, you have this enormous expanse of geography with sovereign tribes on them. And as I'm driving for 1,000 miles, when was the last time the word Cherokee Nation was uttered on an American cable network, right? When
Great
has
point.
anybody talked about anything going on, right, in any of the lives? For example, when is the last time, if you've turned on CNN and you've watched what's happening in the cattle industry in Texas or in the energy industry? And so I think there's a lot of anger, and FDR understood this. He talked about the forgotten man, the forgotten woman. There's a lot of anger that generates from not being seen,
Totally agree.
right? At the same time, and I worked for somebody in California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think has an environmental record as second to none. And he's one of the great environmental leaders politically. You
I have a
know,
great
last
relationship with Arnold. I think highly of him.
right last 100 years, real achievements in dealing with the environment. I think when you look at like an energy issue, for example, right? There's a lot of jobs in the country that are energy dependent. New Taylor Sheridan show, right?
Yeah.
Landman, right? About the energy business. And I think that a lot of people out there, right? You don't have to hear things 20 times for it to sink in, right? If you work in energy, extracting it, finding it, selling it, processing it, you have heard a lot of hostility from Democratic politicians about your job, as in, we're going to get rid of it. And then I was sitting on a panel not recently, and I don't want to say who the person was, but it was a prominent Democrat. There was a Democratic congressman there, and it was like, and I approached it like I was on a Law and Order episode, right? Not a political debate, and I was like, really? Like, genuinely, you're surprised that somebody who would have a job, right, like working in this sector of the economy, would have like a lot of skepticism towards the Democratic Party on the basis of what they've heard. And it doesn't matter, right? If it's a black guy working in the energy industry, Hispanic guy, right? Black woman, Hispanic woman, right? The message is the same, which is this party, for a bunch of different reasons, thinks my job somewhere in the chain of producing energy is bad and has got to go. When you start on a 4-year basis now in the aftermath of this defeat, if you went to give a speech in Tulsa, right, which is still in America, um, for those that don't turn off the MSNBC, um, what would you say to them, right? What is the misperception about the party? Right, about the Democratic Party, right, that you want to be a leader in over the next decade? What don't they get about what the Democratic Party has been and can be again that you want to tell them?
Let's start with the Democratic Party wants to make America the best manufacturing nation again. We want to make sure we're ahead of China. We want to have the most innovative, most dynamic economy doing incredible things in every part of the nation. Now, we believe and recognize the contributions that people have made in coal, in oil, in building steel, in doing all of the things that made America America. And there would be no Silicon Valley if it weren't for the coal miners. There would be no American middle class if it weren't for a lot of the energy production. But we also want to make sure that as we have this energy, that we're not letting China or some other country lead in the new energy sources. And it would be malpractice for America to say, okay, we are fine with what we have had, and we're not going to compete and be the best in the world in the new technology. And that's why when solar is at 3 cents a kilowatt hour and is the cheapest, that we're going to invest in that. But we're also going to invest in nuclear, and we're also going to invest in wind and geothermal, and we will make sure then nothing compromises our ability to be the best manufacturer, to have good, high-paying jobs as we invest in this new energy source. So it is additive; it is not subtractive. And by the way, when you look at other countries, they're doing it, and I don't want them to have the advantage over us when it comes to this. I mean, we have to work on some of the details, but that would be my message. And I think Americans understand and will embrace innovation, but they should know that it's not that their jobs are going to be going away. This is about adding new sources of energy.
A lot of times there's a discussion that takes place about what would John McCain think about, right, this particular moment. And people speculate about it, and I'm occasionally asked about it. And I generally don't entertain it because it's a fantasy, right? It's when you're gone, you're not coming back. But I have entertained it recently about two events that if I could talk to John McCain, right? I would tell him two things, right? If I had 5 minutes with him, the first would be, you're completely right about the Russians. They've invaded Ukraine and they're advancing on World War III. But the other thing I would talk to him about is campaign finance reform. And I would say, well, Donald Trump has just won his second non-consecutive term against Joe Biden, who went for his second term. And along the way, the richest man in the world spent 200+ million of his own money in American dollars, right? $200 million, right? And to put this in, $277 million to be exact, in the entire budget of the McCain campaign in 2008 to have an appreciation for political inflation was about $700 million, right? So Elon spent $277 million, and an hour before the polls closed, his net worth was somewhere around, give or take a few billion, let's call it $250 billion. Since Trump has won, right? It was, as of last week, scored at 400 billion, pushing upwards now to 500 billion, nearly doubling with 34 days before Trump takes office. And so, how are you going to talk about that? How are you going to reach out to an American in these places, normal people, and explain to them on an issue that's never had much currency? And all of us have lived outside of the Tammany era, right, or the 1890s, before the creation, right, of the civil service, in eras of rampant, unrestrained corruption. How would you explain this to people in a way that they can comprehend it, access it, and appreciate that democracy's really on very thin ice when you're living in that country, when the billionaires are lined up around the block? That's not the free enterprise system. That's something else. When the richest, most powerful people in the country think that they have to, in order to continue to operate, go down to Mar-a-Lago and kiss the ring. So what? How do you think about that? How would you explain it? What is the deeper meaning of it?
Well, John McCain was, in my lifetime, probably the strongest voice against corruption in government and big money in government. And a lot of his integrity, of course, came from that. I mean, people appreciated the extraordinary sacrifice he made as a prisoner of war for America. But in terms of young people and modern America, they saw the integrity he showed in fighting a system that they knew was corrupt, and then now has gotten much worse. And the first thing I guess I'd say to folks is, we didn't fight a revolution in this country to have billionaires spend millions of dollars on our television screens and our phones in deciding elections. There's something fundamentally insulting about that to ordinary Americans, in terms of the pride with which we cast a vote, the pride with which we go to a town hall, the pride with which we discuss politics in this country. That's a great thing. You don't have to be a professor at Harvard to have an opinion about politics. Whether you are a secretary, whether you're a truck driver, your opinion matters as much, probably more than if you were some fancy professor. That's the essence of America, and that's what's being questioned when you have billionaires, by the way, on both sides, who are pouring in this money to try to say that they get to decide these elections. And, you can admire someone like Elon Musk for putting rockets up in space and still have the view that he shouldn't have a bigger voice than you when it comes to our democracy. He maybe has a bigger voice in how to put a rocket up in space, but he shouldn't have a bigger voice than any other American in electing our congresspeople, our senators, or our president. That's why we fought a revolution. That's the core idea of America. If you agree with that, then let's do what Maine did as a start. 70% passed it, Republicans, independents, and Democrats. And they said, you know what, Musk or Gates, you can contribute to these super PACs, but you can't contribute more than $3,300, just like you can't give more to a candidate. And let's get the big millions of dollars out of our politics. One of the things I hope the next DNC chair will do is take the initiative and run that Maine ballot in 50 states. That's our 50-state strategy. We're going to get super PAC millionaires out of the super PAC business. And that, I think, would be worthy of sort of what John McCain was doing in 2000 and 2008 and McCain-Feingold, because, of course, McCain-Feingold was addressing exactly this independent expenditures.
I was thinking about my Canadian wife. She was flabbergasted. I was at the Floribama bar, which is on the Florida-Alabama state line, 2 July 4th ago, and I got recognized by a couple people there. And she was like really surprised, like, that this isn't your MSNBC crowd, right? Resistance crowd, right? We're in deep South Alabama here. And what I said to her is, we're in the United States, right? Like Alabama still voted, right? 43%, whatever the number is. I don't know it off the top of my head, but Kamala Harris got 42, 43, 44% of the vote in the state likely. So what do you say when you're in the political meetings, right, with colleagues about states that, listen, we got to start competing, right? We got to start trying, right, in states that are red states. I mean, we may lose 3 or 4 elections. I think Texas is a great model of this, right? Beto O'Rourke, I think, moved the ball. I think Colin Allred was a great candidate. But you have to keep building, and you have to build an infrastructure in every state if you're going to be a national party, or you're doomed to be a coastal party. And when the center caves in on that coastal party, I think it leaves you where you're sitting right now, which is, for the country in a really bad spot with Republicans, controlling all the levers of power, and in a moment in time where I think he intends to abuse that power, with abandon over the next months in a way that's going to shock some people.
Well, look, you're absolutely right, and I hope that this is a time for that kind of serious thinking and reform of our party, because I do believe, unfortunately, Trump is going to abuse that power, and I think that is going to give us a chance to come back in 26 and 28. But that's not going to be a durable majority if we don't do what you're talking about. We could win by default, but as Churchill said, you want to deserve victory, and to deserve victory, we want to be competing in all of these places on our vision of how we're going to create high-paying jobs, how we're going to bring new industry, why we understand the modern economy. Let me give you a concrete example of something we could say. You talked about the opioid crisis. This is a media example of not covering Silicon Valley properly. Every time they cover Silicon Valley, it's Bitcoin and AI. You know what one of the most interesting companies right outside my district is? It's a neurotech company where they have a helmet that if people put on this helmet, they can help them in overcome addiction. And it's in the preliminary stages, but 11 out of 12 people who were addicted to opioids after they used this helmet were able to overcome that addiction. Imagine if the Democratic Party says, look, we're going to make investments in the fundamental kind of biotechnology that is actually going to help solve the opioid crisis in this country. We're going to make the investments with business leaders in actually putting new industry and jobs in your communities, because you can't just do that with deregulation and tax cuts. You want to know what Intel CEO, who just was pushed out, I had breakfast with him. He said, you can't compete with Wall Street's quarterly earnings. And so what's going to happen now? If you just have tax cuts, if you just have streamlining, DOGE, you think Intel is going to be able to manufacture it in America? No. You need to give tax credits for American chips to be bought. You need some tariffs on the Taiwan chips, but you also need federal financing for those factories. And the Democrats have the comprehensive vision of how do we have a economic strategy for high-paying jobs? How do we have new technology that benefits communities? And we need to be confident to take that across the country. Andy Beshear is governor of Kentucky. You can win in those states. We should certainly go in Ohio, Ashtabula County that was deindustrialized, places like Dayton, places like where we have the CHIPS Act in Columbus, and offer our vision. And I think we can be competitive and eventually win.
I was having a discussion that came out of the murder of the United Healthcare CEO, and it was about health insurance and its brokenness in the country. And one of the things that I said in this conversation was that we're very close in a moment, really in time, a convergence of science and all of this, where you're going to have a blood draw at birth and a genetic profile that will determine what you will be coverable for, it seems to me, unless there are some bills of rights established around these areas that are private, unusable in law. And everybody's affected by that. And that populist streak of looking at an issue that affects everybody, an abuse that will be used by a few to make money from the many, right? That for sure is coming. And how do you protect, right, the individual citizen? Right? How do you declare through deed, not just word, that, hey, right, in essence, we're on your side, right? And here's our agenda that proves it. Uh, any conversations in that vein happening on the Democratic side yet, on the House side, amongst what I would call some of the more reform-minded members like yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, there is a sense in this country that we're producing more wealth than we ever have before. We've gone from 53rd in the world in income inequality to 128. And people don't get it. They don't understand how you can be producing AI and you can be producing biotechnology and neurotechnology, and you can't give people healthcare. It's a policy failure. It is a moral failure. And I, of course, have said, look, the most efficient and best way is Medicare for all. But before we get there, you can do some basic things. You can say that AI should not be making decisions in terms of whether to deny you care or not over a doctor. That these insurance companies shouldn't be having the type of data that you're saying and then put it into some system and deny care based on that. You can say that you should have a right to your data so that you have to consent before an insurance company can use that data. You can say that if a doctor prescribes something and Medicare would cover it, your private insurance should cover it. There are simple things that we can do. And I think that there is such anger at the system because people have had personal experiences of having care denied. They've had huge out-of-pocket costs. And they look at the system and they say, why in this country can we not have basic health care when we're producing so much wealth?
Last question that I have for you. I know you got to go do some congressional business.
I think they're calling votes soon. So.
Right, they're calling votes, and we need you to vote. The situation, the moment that Trump becomes president, it's as predictable as the sun rising in the east tomorrow. He's going to turn on a fire hose. And he's going to pardon, for example, all but the most violent January 6th defendants. And he'll announce 100 other things that all of them on their own will be enough, right, to get you, right, to start clutching your chest. So, how do you think about it? Right, the stoicism, right, the fortitude inside, right? There's, when you anytime you have, 100 some odd people, the Democratic, conference, everyone's a unique, special, one of a kind person. It's a same in kindergarten, college, the fraternities, sorority, the team, right? In the Democratic conference, how do you restrain and focus response? And what are you most worried about that he's going to do out of the gate? For me, it's the deployment of the military into the country for any reason. And I just had this conversation with Paul Rieckhoff, the veteran
Yeah, I
activist.
have a lot of
And
respect for him.
and and I said, I just, like I mentioned to you, I said I just drove across the country, and I noticeably on this trip, I did not see a lot of cops. Like maybe of the 6 or 7 times I've driven across the country, fewest cops on the road of all of those trips. But I didn't see any military on the road. And I said, I got to drive back in 6 months. When I drive back, am I going to be able to see I didn't? Am I going to be able to say I didn't see a lot of military vehicles on the road? And he said, I don't think so. Do you think I'm going to see a lot of military vehicles out on America's interstates? The military substantially deployed, state national guards federalized, sent into the interior of the country to do law enforcement of any type with regard to the great deportation or otherwise.
As you know, it's fundamentally illegal to use the military for that purpose. That is probably not going to stop Donald Trump. I mean, he can use what Tom Cotton floated as the Insurrection Act, and he can try to use emergency powers. But I think that will be a gross overreach. I mean, look, I think Americans want those who cross the border and are committing crimes in the United States, or killing people, or committing sexual assault, or committing drug offenses, to be kicked out? Absolutely, they do. And absolutely, people who have committed violent crimes, felonies, have no place in the United States. But do I think that they want the military going in to McDonald's, to Walmart, to Costco, and asking people for their papers, and asking people for their papers regardless if they're an American citizen? No, they do not want that. And that's why I think the polling on this question is not informative, because when people think deportation, some of them are saying, yeah, I don't want the criminals here. And the country hasn't done enough to make sure criminals are in the United States. But they're not thinking the military showing up at people's places of employment and asking for papers. That's fundamentally un-American.
Right. I lied to you. I have one more
Yeah.
follow-up question. And obviously I
Do you agree with
completely
me on
agree with
that?
you. But here's the question on that. Is there a meeting that takes place? I've never been in Congress. Like, I have no idea. But I'd like
You
to,
got to run, Steve. We could
if
use
I
you.
was in Congress,
Run in the
I
26th
like
cycle.
to
We'll pick a vulnerable
I,
Republican and take
I
him out.
I like to think that I would be in the room, and I would say, I would raise my hand, right, to my elders
Yeah.
up there, and I would say, how do we assess whether Trump is going to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1792 or 8, whatever the year is,
Yeah.
deploy the military? How do we cut off funding for it as expeditiously as possible? How do we oppose it? How do we oppose it legally? But most importantly, how do we oppose it politically? And, right, do we think he's going to do it? And I do, right? And B, I agree with you completely, right? It's a bridge too far, and it's a dramatic, holy shit overreach in this country right? That's a few years off of one of the biggest social protest movements, right, in its history, which was fundamentally about over policing, right? Pendulum went wackadoodle, but putting that aside, I don't think there's any appetite for that. But is there a conversation that takes place on the serious people side of the Democratic conference when you are like, we assess the probability that this may happen. We have a plan for dealing with it if it's doing it. And if he does it, and he said that he's going to, right, that we appreciate it as the moment of first massive overreach that is the new fighting line. We have to fight it out on that ground. Have people talked about that? Like
Not as
directly, openly, and clearly, like in open and honest debate in the conference?
Not as clearly as you, which is why I'm encouraging on this podcast the draft Steve Schmidt candidacy for Congress for 2026. But
I think it would be a great thing to do for a couple of years, but I can't. There's one thing that I could not handle about it, and it's what you said at the beginning. It's that I would psychologically, I could not handle being taken prisoner, right, at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning by like Lauren Boebert and her friends, not knowing where I'm going, when I can leave, right, if I'm going to be able to get on the flight. And there's no purpose to it, right, other than nonsense, right? That I've totally, so your service, and I don't think people appreciate that enough, is that it requires you to hang in there and constantly be jerked around by some of the what I regard really despicable people for no good reason whatsoever, other than like the politics of smallness and harassment. And it would be really hard, like to sit there and to take it and do it. So it's a tough job in that regard. And I admire anybody who does it, but I hope you're having those conversations.
I think you'd be great at it. But look, we are having some of the conversations, I mean, Raskin and I, but I think what you're urging us to do, and I'm actually going to take this back to both Jamie, who as the ranking member on judiciary is going to be a point in coming up with this and is a constitutional law professor, so really has expertise, and Hakeem, and say, we've got to map this out. And here are the 3 or 4 things where we're going to really come together and have a concerted strategy and have a clear sense that this is across the line. Because like you said, he's going to come with a fire hose. He's going to do 100 crazy things. And if we have 100 different members of Congress on MSNBC and your podcast and CNN and online talking about all the 100 different things, the American people are just going to say, oh, there they go again. They've got Trump derangement syndrome. They're just saying everything Trump does is wrong. Instead, if we say very clearly, no, these are the 2 or 3 places that it's not just that he's violating the Constitution. That's a very academic way of saying it. It's that he's violating everything you know and believe and are proud of being an American. He's violating that fundamental sense that of your freedom, of your independence. And I look. I have a lot of faith in this country. I have a lot of faith. It's a country that can elect James Buchanan and Abraham Lincoln, but over the long
Within
run,
4 years of one another.
within 4 years. So I'm not saying that they get every decision right, but I do think over the long run, and I don't mean by the long run 20 years. I think it's probably these days it's 2 to 4 years. I think the American people correct and they course adjust. And I rather have the wisdom of the American people than any smart pointy head at making decisions. And that's why I think there's an opportunity for us that if we stick to a few core places to push back where he overreaches, and if we come back with humility and say, look, we get it. We get that there were forgotten Americans and forgotten places. And you know what? We probably didn't do enough. And we're here humbly to listen, to learn, and here's what we're going to do. I think the American people are going to give us a chance. I really do. And by the way, I don't buy this nonsense that, oh, we can't have a woman, we can't have a woman of color. No, this is once they elected Barack Hussein Obama, that said to me that this is a country where anyone, if you put in the time and you earn the respect, can win. It's a great country. It's still the greatest country. And it's still the most cohesive multiracial democracy in the history of the world. And I'll end with this point, Steve. If you had told me growing up in Bucks County in the 1980s, that we would have an African-American, Indian-American woman who would be running for president, who would have one of the major parties' nominees and would come within 1.5% of winning my birth state of Pennsylvania and the presidency, I would have said, you're crazy. This country is making progress. We're trying to do something no nation in the history has ever done, to be a cohesive democracy with people from every part of the world who've been here. And it's an awesome thing. And we're in the fight to make that happen.
Well, as someone who grew up in New Jersey, talking to someone who grew up in Bucks County, you guys were like the guys in the woods, like the Yellowstone characters, right? Living out there in
Now,
the
were you on the southern part of
out.
New Jersey and an Eagles fan, or northern part and a
I
Giants
was
fan?
a I was a Jets fan,
All
so
right.
I was a Jets and Yankees, but I was on the northern side of it. But listen, to everybody out in the audience, that one of the great things about America is the resiliency of the country. And it is resilient because almost providentially, it produces leaders at the right time, at the right place. Dwight Eisenhower is a perfect example. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Army who hadn't been promoted in 13 years until he was in 1940, and the rest is history. So Ro Khanna is a name that if you're watching this, you're going to hear more of. His national profile is going to be building over the next couple of years because he's a person of conviction, person of guts, person of integrity. And when you combine those qualities at a time of national crisis, the result is the forging of new leaders with new ideas, and with new leaders and new ideas comes new possibilities. And what follows eras of crisis in America as we get ready to celebrate this country's 250th year is the possibility for reform and renewal. And the politics that comes next is the politics of next. And Ro Khanna is going to be a big part of that, everybody. So follow him, pay attention. This is The Warning. It's great to be with you. And Ro Khanna, thank you very much, Congressman, for your time today.
Thank you. I'm honored by that. Certainly, I've never been put in the same sentence as Eisenhower, and I'll concede Eisenhower as one of the great Americans. But I appreciate your point about renewal and reform. That's actually really well put, and a chance for new leadership. And Steve, you are very much part of that, whether you're going to be in Congress or not. And maybe I'll end with that point that this is not a time to just leave it to the House Democrats. I mean, this is a moment where it's going to take all of us to have that renewal. And the great thing about this era is sometimes your podcast has often more reach than a House floor speech. So let's all work together to have that reform and renewal.
Great way to leave it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning, and I invite you to subscribe on our Substack, on our YouTube channel. Follow us. Welcome to the community.